This is Book TV's Afterwards. Each week, a top nonfiction author is interviewed by a journalist, public policymaker, legislator, or others familiar with their work. We post the podcast every Sunday. Subscribe and never miss an episode. This week, our guest is ABC News Chief White House Correspondent Jonathan Karl. He'll discuss his book, Front Row at the Trump Show. He's interviewed by former White House press secretary for Bill Clinton, Mike McCurry.
Jonathan, it's great to talk to you today about this wonderful book that you've written. And I want to start with you by the beginning and the end of the book, because you have two different encounters with Donald Trump. And the first is when you're a young cub reporter at the New York Post, and the last is when obviously you're, a big White House hotshot reporter. But describe those two different encounters with Trump, because I think that's kind of the arc of the book kind of goes between those two.
It's a really incredible bookends, Mike. The first was I was, in my 20s, I was working for the New York Post. I was actually assigned to City Hall. There was a guy there that was mayor, by the way, at that time. He had just become mayor. His name is Rudy Giuliani.
Of whom we know.
Yes. And there was this absolutely unbelievable story that had gripped New York City at that particular moment. It was not a story that I was particularly interested in, but I was working for the New York Post, and it was all that my editors cared about. It was news had just broken that Michael Jackson, the king of pop, had just married Lisa Marie Presley, Elvis Presley's daughter. They had married in secret. They had not been seen in public yet, and they were staying at Trump Tower. So when this news broke out, everybody convened, all the paparazzi, anybody, all the curiosity seekers. This is New York City. This is
and it's the New York Post.
And it's the New York Post. And by the way, Michael Jackson is at his absolute peak of popularity at this moment. And the crowd around Trump Tower became so intense they actually put a police cordon around the block, and people had to get across the street because it was just too many people trying to get in there and trying to get a glimpse of the newlyweds. Not
Donald Trump.
No, not Donald Trump. This is Michael Jackson and Elvis Presley's daughter, for God's sake, right? But they are staying at Trump Tower. So I'm at City Hall, and nobody cares what's going on at City Hall at this particular moment, particularly not at the New York Post. So on a whim, I said, how can I get a piece of this story? So I called up this number for the Trump Organization, and it was just the general number. I mean, I didn't know Donald Trump. I didn't have any connection to Donald Trump whatsoever. I was a young reporter. I'd only been at the Post for like 7 or 8 months. I was a new reporter in town, and I called the number and I said, "Can I talk to Donald Trump?" And I was connected to Norma Federer, who was his gatekeeper at the time, his longtime press secretary, practically a member of the Trump family. She had the desk right outside of his office there at Trump Tower on the 26th floor, and everything went through Norma. I didn't know this at the time. It was just a voice on the end of the phone. So I said, "I've got a story to pitch to Mr. Trump." And she said, "What is it?" I said, "Why would the most famous newlyweds in the world want to have their honeymoon at Trump Tower?" And she passed it on. I got a call back almost immediately from Trump himself. And I didn't know how he would respond, but he said, "Come on over. Can you come now?" So I'm at the New York Post's office, which were down, Manhattan. At that point, they were down in South Street.
Yeah, they're down Lower Manhattan.
Lower Manhattan, South Street, the other side of Chinatown. And I tell my editor I've got this, and they're like, "Okay, great." Here they send me with a photographer. His name was Francis Becker. We hustled our way up to Midtown, got to the police cordon, were immediately let through, went in through, Trump was there, was brought up to his office, and there's a photo in the book, which is a little embarrassing.
You look like the kid that you were at that point.
Yeah, and I remember at the time, because he comes in, he's like, let me show you around, let me show you why, why they're here. The story, by the way, and I think we also have a picture of the front page article that ended up written, was about the secret honeymoon hideaway for Michael and Lisa Marie. It was massive coverage in the paper. I had like 5 pages inside. And, we went around, we met Michael's bodyguards. He showed me the secret tunnels they got in and out of Trump Tower on to avoid all the people outside. They showed me, their secret getaway car, which probably wasn't a great thing. And he was telling me where everybody lived in Trump Tower, all the other famous people. You had
Spielberg.
Yeah, Andrew Lloyd Webber, the British royal family, Sophia Loren, pointed me out where they all were. We actually ran inside a drawing of Trump Tower with arrows pointing to the apartments owned by these various people who probably were trying to be discreet. But it was something else. But at one point in the middle of the tour, Trump says, "Do you want a picture?" And I was like, "Well, I've got my photographer. Don't you see that we're taking pictures all?" I didn't know what he was talking about. But then it became obvious he meant, do I want to take a picture with him? Which, as a journalist, you don't usually stop in the middle of an interview and say, "Hey, can we get a shot together?"
Do a selfie with each other.
Yeah. So the picture was snapped, and you see it in the book. I actually had this picture. I put it in a frame back when I was living in New York 25 years ago, and then when I moved to D.C. a few years later, it was I threw it in a box with a bunch of old photos. And it was only after Trump became president that I was like, I wonder if I still have that picture. And I broke it out. And it's an amazing moment because he looks, captured in this picture, because he looks exactly the same. I mean, he's a little bit heavier now. He's a little thinner back then. But he's wearing the same type of suit, the long red tie that's a little longer than anybody else would wear it. The hair is essentially the same. He's got this expression that I've seen in 1,000 pictures that he has taken now from behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. And it's like, but I was thinking as I was writing this book, right when I was almost done, I got summoned into the Oval Office to meet with the president.
Yeah, that's the end of the book.
That's the bookend, and it was I was president of the White House Correspondents Association. He had some complaints specifically about a story I had done, and also about a story that had run in the Washington Post over Labor Day weekend. By the way, I don't know how many other people maybe even noticed the story or noticed my story, but he was keenly aware of both of them. And had some things he wanted to raise with us. So we were brought into the Oval Office, and I described the scene. It's one of the odder moments in a time when there have been many odd moments, Mike. But I was, you spent a lot of time there as White House press secretary. I was brought in by the press secretary and the chief of staff. This was Stephanie Grisham and Mick Mulvaney. And I brought with me 2 of my colleagues on the White House Correspondents Association board, Zeke Miller and Steve Portnoy. We were brought in through the outer Oval. The Oval Office was empty. We were asked to sit at the 3 chairs that were out in front of the desk. And then we were told, wait. And then Mulvaney and Stephanie Grisham left us in the Oval Office. Now, I don't know how many times you worked there. I don't know how many times you were in the Oval Office alone. But I've never been in the Oval Office alone. The doors were closed. It was just the 3 of us. And I can't tell you exactly how long it was. I think it was about 2 or 3 minutes. But it felt like an hour. Yeah. And, Zeke Miller, who's with AP, leaned over to me and he's like, we're like,
what are we doing?
We're definitely being taped, right? I mean, we're definitely being watched. So we just sat there in silence, and then the president came back in, and we had this meeting that lasted about, it lasted upwards of an hour, and I at one point sat there thinking that here I am sitting across the Resolute desk from the president of the United States, who is Donald Trump, and 25 years ago, almost to the day, 25 years earlier, I had been with him in Trump Tower running around, trying to find, Michael Jackson's bodyguards and, doing this kind of gossipy tour of celebrity apartments in his building. And, who could have imagined that I would end up where I was and that he would end up where he was? Here I was like a really junior tabloid reporter in New York City. He was this flamboyant developer who liked to get his name in the tabloids. And then 25 years, almost to the day later, I am the president of the White House Correspondents Association, sitting across the Resolute desk from that former flamboyant developer, Donald Trump, as president of the United States. And it was really, and like you said, the whole story the incredible story of how we went from that moment to that final moment is really what Front Row of the Trump Show is about.
Well, isn't there something there's a seductive quality that he has that kind of rings through all of this, which is he at the one time is declaring you to be an enemy of the people, and I want you to talk a little bit about that. But at the same time, he is looking for approval and engagement and, wanting to be involved and to, have, some kind of relationship with the people that he's dealing with in the media. It's a fascinating juxtaposition, I think, of the role that he plays. And I think that you see that play out, and you write about that in the book a lot. But what's that like? Because he's got this simultaneous quality of wanting to declare the press to be fake news and enemy of the people, and yet at the same time looking for your personal approval and wanting to engage you and to be, kind of pals with you. It's a weird thing.
It is fascinating because I've had the incredible privilege of being a reporter who has covered a White House for 4 different presidents. I mean, I was only in there a bit when you were there. I was a junior CNN reporter. I was occasionally sent to fill in. But I remember being there, with you during the chaos of the Monica Lewinsky scandal.
Don't remind me.
Yes, and and George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama, and now this. Every one of those presidents complained about press coverage. Every one of those presidents thought that the press focused on it was way too negative, didn't see the great accomplishments of the administration. That's standard operating procedure. But, Trump's attacks go far beyond any of that. I mean, literally, it's not just, so you have enemy of the people, which is a phrase which I spent a little bit of time in the book about the origins of that phrase. It's a very ugly phrase that's been used by used by Stalin, used by Hitler, used during the French Revolution to justify the beheadings of people by guillotine.
John, talk a little bit more about that. That's like one of the most interesting parts of the book is unpacking that phrase, and you do that at some length in a couple of chapters, and really, go through what a noxious phrase that is if you look back at the history of it. But talk about that a little bit.
I spent some time looking through the origins of the phrase, and it was used quite prominently during the French Revolution. That's really the most significant place.
People got beheaded as a result,
and basically the justification was, the people that were targeted by the law under which they were found guilty and beheaded, the actual law uses that phrase, enemy of the people. And I go through and I document the use of it during the Reign of Terror, when blood was flowing in the streets of Paris. And then the other place, the next place I saw it was with in Germany, the plebiscite that was that gave Hitler his powers. I go back and I find this article that was an Associated Press article ran on the front page of the New York Times and many other newspapers around the world. And right there in the in the lead paragraph, you see the National Socialist Party making the case that anybody who votes against this is an enemy of the people. So you have the Nazis using the phrase, and then you see it, a bit later used by Joseph Stalin. I mean, this is now maybe I'm not saying that Donald Trump knew that was the the history behind this phrase, but it was certainly pointed out by a lot of people that it had this really dark and morbid and deadly history, and he kept using it. And the whole notion of it creates the sense that the act of being an aggressive reporter, of trying to hold those in power accountable, that you are essentially a traitor to your country. I would argue it's the exact opposite. This is an essential part about what, to use a phrase, what makes America great. But Mike, the flip side that you allude to is that this is a president who consumes more news than any of those presidents. He knows the reporters. He reads the stories. He watches the news coverage. He once privately said TiVo was the greatest. TiVo, early DVR, was the greatest invention of mankind because he has all of the shows on his DVR, and he watches and he sees how he's being portrayed. And I recall him at one point, Phil Rucker with the Washington Post, who's a really good reporter. At press conference, the president made reference to a story that Phil had written before the New York primary, in 2016, about the Staten Island ferry, and about Phil basically went and interviewed people on the Staten Island ferry and found there were a lot of people who really liked Donald Trump, and he wrote this story about it. I mean, I didn't even see the story. Trump not only saw the story and read it. This has now been a couple years earlier, and he becomes president. He goes through all that he's been through, and he sees Phil Rucker, not exactly a household name, by the way. Great reporter. We all know him, but and he's like, yeah, that story you wrote about the Staten Island ferry, that was a wonderful story. I mean, it's mind blowing. He knows the reporters. He knows the reporters. I mean, he knows. I've known him for a long time, but he knows, most people in that room by name, knows what they've done. Many of them have probably gotten phone calls from him, either to complain about something that was written or to offer something up. I mean, Barack Obama and people, particularly on the right, people say that there was, the media was infatuated with Obama. First of all, the Obama White House complained bitterly about the White House press corps.
Every president, going back to George Washington, has complained about press coverage. So there's nothing new about any of that.
Nothing new, but Obama would come into that briefing room and do a press conference, and I swear he didn't know more than a hand. I mean, he had no idea who was in the room. I remember at one point he's like, he gets the list of questions from his press, of who to call on from his press secretary, which some presidents do, some don't. But that was the practice with Obama. The press secretary would say, here's who you should call on. And I remember him at one point looking down on his list, and he reads the name of the AP reporter, and then he looks up like, okay, where is... And of course the AP reporter is sitting right there in front. That's the AP seat.
Right.
And you'd think that he would know the AP reporter, but no idea. George W. Bush, he did know the personalities, didn't know the people. He even knew, the camera operators, some of them, if they had been with him on the campaign. But Donald Trump, he consumes the news. He's fascinated by it. He relishes it. He has talked about, he's marveled many times, some publicly, some not, about how many times he dominates the front page of the New York Times, a paper he likes to attack, but he's so proud of the fact that he is on, when he is on the front page of the Times. Really, even if it's negative, he's there, he's being covered. So it's a fascinating dichotomy.
Well, it's a weird love-hate relationship in some ways, but let me ask you a question, because as you mentioned, you're prominently involved in the White House Correspondents Association and have a leadership position there. But why hasn't the press corps more aggressively challenged this war that he's declared on you. He's declared you to be the enemy of the people. Why haven't you fought back more aggressively?
Well, first of all, I think that there has been fighting back on that. I know when he first used the phrase, I went on. I was anchoring our Sunday show this week with George Stephanopoulos that Sunday, and I did a thing at the end of the program where I pointed out the history of the phrase and pushed back aggressively. But I have to say that doing that's not easy because
it's not the role that you're.
No.
No journalist feels like they want to be making the news. They want to report the news, and then I think that's part of the dilemma, right?
It really is. We are not the resistance. We are not the opposition party. That was the phrase I also talked about. Steve Bannon was the first to use. Say the media is the opposition party, and then Trump grabbed onto that. We can't act like the opposition party. We do have to push back, and I do push back on this. There was especially in my role as representing the White House press corps. When the stuff gets dangerous, when it is over the top, it needs to be called out. There was an incident where there was an event for a Trump a pro-Trump organization at one of the president's properties in Florida, and they had an exhibit where they played this video clip. It was a doctored scene from a movie that showed somebody in a church killing news people and Democrats, and it was horrific. And we had. You gotta call this stuff out. It's actually dangerous. We saw with the guy who sent the pipe bombs, poorly made, fortunately, to CNN. There will be people, and I've said this to the president directly, and I recount that at the end of the book. Is that there are sick people who will take these words literally and to heart, and hurt people. It's dangerous, and it's particularly irresponsible coming from the person with the biggest bully pulpit of all, coming from the president.
You raised that with the White House staff, with the press secretary, with other people?
Yes, but one thing that you have to recognize with this White House is. And this is another theme of the book, is Donald Trump does seek out advice. He does listen to people, but ultimately he goes in his own direction. Sometimes he takes the advice, sometimes he doesn't. But he truly is. He is his own chief of staff. Various. Some of the. John Kelly tried to kind of change that for a while, had some moderate success, but. He is his own chief of staff. He is his own national security advisor. We saw that with John Bolton. John Bolton's national security advisor, and the president's going off in a, diametrically opposed on several major hot button issues. He's certainly his own communications director and his own press secretary.
Talk a little bit about that and about, the press briefing. That's a subject that I obviously care about, having done many of them myself, but. He's now turned the press briefing room into his platform for delivering a daily message, since he's not out doing rallies and things like that. But why do we need to have a daily press briefing? And what's the role of the press secretary? And what do you need as you're covering the White House?
Well, we went all that time, a year without having any briefings by a press secretary. We had, occasionally, like Mick Mulvaney came in and did a briefing famously. I think we just passed a 1-year anniversary of no press briefing by the press secretary, which I find astonishing. But it is. It is, and you make a point which I think is a valid one and an important one, which is which I want to get to. But my argument about the need for a press secretary having regular press briefings. Now we're in an extraordinary moment right now where the president, is doing his own briefings every day. And I mean, that's a whole different scene. We're in an extraordinary time, this crisis. But I think it is important during any time to see the person who is speaking on behalf of the executive branch of the United States government, who is speaking on behalf of the president, come out and take questions every day from all comers. And I think it's important, first of all, in terms of our news gathering, even though admittedly, the information is not always all that useful under any press secretary, some more useful than others. But I think it's important symbolically. It sends a message to the country. It sends a message to the world that the most powerful person in our government is accountable. It's kind of, in a way, we don't have question period like the British Prime Minister has in Parliament. But this is somebody speaking on behalf of the executive branch who has to sit there and take questions, which some of them are quite uncomfortable, from an unruly group of reporters. But you make another point, which is the process of preparing for that briefing helps clarify policymaking and leads to better policy. And I think that's an interesting point, too.
Well, yeah, and my point is that the preparation to do that briefing every day requires you to go around the government and talk to cabinet officials, talk to the president and other senior officials in the White House to get real clear information, because you're going to get the questions. And the process of getting the right answer sometimes leads to better policy. So like sometimes I would go to President Clinton and would say, okay, here's the answer that I'm supposed to give today. And he would say, well, that's just hooey. And you'd say, well, yeah, but that's your policy. And so he'd pick up the phone and call someone and say, well, look, we need to get, we got to get this right. What are we doing on this issue? So it would actually improve the functioning of government. And so the reality of doing that briefing is much more than just taking care of the press and feeding the press what it needs every day. It also has a reverberating effect throughout all of government, because people have to come up with better answers. And if you come up with better answers, that usually means you're going to get better policy. And so I'm a very strong advocate of doing that. But the other question, sometimes it turns into performance art or theater of the absurd, we might say. And I wonder whether the whole public encounter and what's on TV and, sitting in the front row and asking the questions knowing that it's going to be on live TV, does that make it less useful? Is that an impediment to trying to get the right information in front of the public? I mean, what should we do about that? It's not easy to ask a television personality that question, but what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that, and I think you and I have actually disagreed on this point. I know you've talked in the past about suggesting that briefings might be more useful if they were not televised. I think that, sure, there is an element, and I've probably been accused of it more than once, and I've certainly looked askance at some of my colleagues and said, like, come on, are you really? I mean, we're trying to do a serious thing here, and you're, like, playing to the cameras. That definitely happens, and it is definitely annoying when it does. But I think that there is symbolic value in the world seeing this play out, in the world seeing that this is the way our system works. Nobody is above the law. Nobody is above scrutiny, public scrutiny. And I also keep in mind, Mike, there's 49 seats in that briefing room. It's a very small room, as you know.
And now being spaced accordingly.
I mean, now there are 14 people sitting at any point. We've had to reduce it and say people can't stand in the aisles anymore, and for the obvious public health reasons. But there's a lot of people who watch those briefings in real time, including reporters who can't be there, including people watching C-SPAN. I mean, I don't know. C-SPAN might also agree with me on this. I think it's important that they're televised. That is not to say that there isn't a really important role for background briefings and briefings that are not on camera. But I think that having the press secretary go out and the world seeing the press secretary go out on a regular basis is a valuable exercise.
C-SPAN was a great relief to nursing mothers. I used to have people say, "Oh gosh, I was up in the middle of the night watching your briefing on TV when I was nursing my baby." So that's what we were reduced to that. But God loves C-SPAN for
absolutely
caring. At one point, before we began to televise the briefings at the White House, that was the only way in which you could see briefings. And so I first was at the State Department, and my briefings at the State Department were on C-SPAN late at night sometimes, and I used to have people come up to me and say, "Oh yeah, I was watching you at 2 a.m." But
by the way, we've talked a lot about the disappearance of the White House briefings, but a tendency we've seen over a big chunk of the Trump era so far is, there were long periods of time would go by without a State Department briefing.
Right.
And I think those are really important. I'm a former State Department reporter. I wasn't there when you were the spokesperson for the State Department, but those are really substantive briefings. They're televised, by the way, as you make reference. But they're really important. It's a whole different set of questions. The idea of those going away, and they've begun to come back. But the Pentagon, I was a Pentagon reporter for some time. I think those,
right.
They a long periods of time went without a Pentagon briefing. That is not healthy.
I told President Clinton one time, I said, there are like 3 really great public spokesman jobs in Washington: White House press secretary, State Department spokesman, Pentagon spokesman. Yep. And you gave me 2 of the jobs, but I have to say that the best one was being State Department spokesman. And he was really curious about this. So, well, why do you say that? I said, well, because it's much more substantive. There, you don't get a lot of political questions. You don't get, a lot of this, sort of stuff that happens sometimes at the White House. You get really informed questions, and as you know, at the State Department, they will stay on a subject and go through it and peel the onion back layer by layer, and then someone will say, next subject, and then you move on to the next subject. And that kind of substance is just not the way in which, the political theater at the White House, if you're in the front row at the White House, is not the same as what you get there. And to not have those kinds of detailed, substantive briefings at places like the Pentagon, the State Department, and even the White House is really, we lose something as a result of that. And I wish there was more of an outcry about that from, members of the press and people who really, know that that's an important part of our democracy.
I remember I loved covering the State Department for that very reason. Really substantive beat, and those briefings. I remember with Boucher as the spokesperson, and Matt Lee with AP, and Arshad Muhammad with Reuters,
right.
and it's just really a really smart group of reporters. And I would go in there, and I always learned. I learned about the world. And sometimes you could see, like with Matt Lee and Stephen Boucher going back and forth, it was like, who knows more? I'm not sure.
You're referencing a guy named Richard Boucher.
Richard Boucher. I'm sorry, Richard Boucher. Yes.
It was actually my tutor. He actually taught me how to do State Department briefings, and
brilliant guy.
Was just a really wonderful guy. And I remember when we made him an ambassador, so he became an ambassador. I think he went to Cyprus, and then went to Hong Kong. He was the consul general in Hong Kong after he had served, because I remember going at one point and kind of arguing when we were making diplomatic assignments at the White House. I said, you got to take care of this guy, because he is like one of the very best of the best, and he's a career public servant. He's what Donald Trump might refer to as the deep state. But those are the quality people that we've got that are doing these kind of career jobs in government. And, to have them be disparaged or to be denigrated is, I think, a real loss. And I hope there's more of a resistance to that in both the press and and people who just kind of care about and speak out for the role that government does play in our lives, and it needs to play. But I'm on my hobby horse.
Yeah,
now.
no, I agree.
Talk a little bit about you've got some interesting stories there about your relationships with Sean Spicer and others, but how do you view the role of the press secretary? You've talked a little bit about how important it is to have someone come out and be accountable, but you write a little bit in the book about some of the personal relationships that you've had, and maybe share some of that from the book.
Yeah, so I mean, Spicer's an interesting one because Sean is somebody who I had known for a long, long time. Considered him a friend. He was somebody, I knew him when he was obviously a spokesperson for the RNC, but I also knew him when he was a press secretary on Capitol Hill. I remember at one point he was involved in a group of Capitol Hill press secretaries, invited me as a young CNN reporter to come and talk to them. I actually shaved Sean's head on national television once.
Yeah, you write about that in the book.
Yeah, it was him and Brad Woodhouse, who was the spokesperson for the Democratic National Committee, and they had made a bet, around one of the elections, and I shaved their heads. It was for St. Baldrick's. It was a great thing, and Sean asked me to do that. Sean was the one who reached out to me to do that. So when it was announced that he had become the press secretary during the transition, that he would be the press secretary in the White House, I called him within about 90 seconds of the news breaking just to congratulate him and say, as somebody who's covered the place for a long time and has worked with a lot of press secretaries, if he needs any help in terms of how, advice on how to deal with the press corps, I'm happy to talk anytime. And almost immediately, when they got into the White House, I thought that Sean kind of became a totally different person, or maybe I just didn't know him as well as I thought I knew him. It was obviously it's the second most difficult job in Washington right now. I think the first is still chief of staff for Donald Trump, but they're both. I mean, you can go either way, and it was pure hostility almost from the start. He
was that Sean, or was that him reflecting what his boss, the President of the United States, was demanding of the staff?
I mean, I think that it was both, but I think it's a big part Sean, because I will tell you, and a lot of people are surprised when I say this, that Sarah Sanders, when she came in, it was an entirely different situation. Now, Sarah tangled with the press when she had press briefings. She was in some ways every bit as controversial as Sean, but Sarah Sanders worked very hard to perform some of those functions of a traditional press secretary and to have a constructive relationship with the White House press corps. I found her generally actually very pleasant to deal with on those logistics and kind of the matters that you have to deal with on, especially through the White House Correspondents Association. We when there's foreign trips, there's extensive give and take over what access there will be, where the press will be. She was responsive. She was she acted much more like a traditional press secretary, and I found a very, very constructive relationship with Sarah Sanders. Sean, it was like pure hostility, all really from day one. He famously had that one press conference. Wasn't actually was not a press conference. It was I don't know what it was. When he came into the briefing room, right after the night after the inauguration, and yelled at everybody for about crowd size, and I reached out to him immediately after. You can imagine. I mean, my colleague Mary Bruce was there for ABC. I was actually in New York. It was a Saturday night, as I recall, and so I was not in the room, but I was obviously watching it. And there were two things that horrified me about that performance. One is that he said at least three things that I could document that were verifiably false. And the second thing, which was as offensive to me, and I think you may appreciate this, is he left the room without taking a single question. Now that is a room to me, it's somewhat of a sacred room, the press briefing room. It is a room for give and take with journalists. A press secretary, and tell me if I'm wrong, you know this better than I do, but I've never witnessed a press secretary come in, speak from the podium, and not take a single question.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that?
No, that would not happen. I have one great story about who was then in the ABC White House correspondent, Britt Hume. And I had done a lot of briefings and, had taken over my role in the 1990s at the White House. And he came up to me one time, came up to my office, he said, you're the most political person we've ever had at that podium. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, you really we usually just get information and facts and content, but you really are doing a lot more of the political spin stuff. And that had a huge, huge impact on me. And, I toned it down after that. But what you're describing is kind of this relationship that exists, that it's you're there to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, as Peter Finley Dunn once said. But the symbiotic relationship between the press corps and the people at the White House is really an important functioning part of our democracy. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate or understand or know about that. But you're speaking to what kind of more the personal elements of this are. And I'm surprised about that relationship that you had with Sean. What about the current press secretary is Stephanie
Grisham, yeah.
Grisham. Do you have any kind of relationship?
I mean, I think Stephanie Grisham's in a very tough circumstance. I mean, this is, like I said, either the first or second hardest job on any given day in Washington. And
you never see her. I mean, she doesn't do briefings, and I think if I ran into her on the street, I wouldn't recognize her. I don't think, because she's just not a public personality the way some of the press secretaries have been.
Yeah. And it's, she's on paper the most powerful press secretary we've ever had, because she
has 3 roles.
She has 3 titles. She is the spokesperson for the First Lady still. That was what she did before she became press secretary. She's press secretary, and she's communications director. But it's,
By the way, that cannot work. I mean, because they are 2 different jobs. I mean, I've always talked about this a lot. The communications director at the White House, the director of communications, is like what I like to use the business analogy. It's product development. You're actually thinking about what's going to be on the menu. What are we going to do a week from now, or down the road? So that's one job. The press secretary is what I would say is retail sales. You're out there to sell the job every day, and they're just 2 incredibly different and complicated jobs, and I just don't know how you could do both of them. And then she also has, I guess, the additional responsibility of being the First Lady's spokesman. So, I kind of, in some ways, pity her, but I also don't think that's a functional way to organize the way in which you do presidential communications.
And then add to the top of it, she comes at a time when the president himself has clearly decided that regular briefings by his press secretary are no longer useful, and he doesn't want them.
Right.
So
because he's going to do, because I am the man.
Yeah.
So I'll go do the briefing myself.
So I have a lot of sympathy for the position she is in. I will say this about Stephanie Grisham. During this particular moment, which has been just a really difficult one to be covering the story, to be at the White House. It's difficult for the whole country, obviously, but with the coronavirus crisis, she has, I think, dealt very constructively in trying to work with me and work with the White House Correspondents Association to make sure that we can continue to cover the story and do it safely. And to take the necessary steps, and it's not easy. It's a really difficult, because we want to be there, we want to be covering the story. Now, could you imagine this? We're just like 2 weeks ago. If you go back in time 2 weeks ago, you still had basically all the press at working at the White House. You had briefings. At any given briefing, there could be 100 people packed into that room. There's 49 seats, but I mean, with the Trump era, anytime there's anything there, it's like, it's more crowded than you can possibly imagine. And imagine if at that point you had somebody come down or multiple people testing positive. You could have literally shut down the entire White House press corps, being forced into quarantine, and then our ability to cover the story is completely over. And plus, you have a lot of sick people. So I've worked very closely actually with her and her office to try to say, what can we do? We will voluntarily as a press corps reduce our numbers. Do it in a way that's responsible, still allows enough people to be there and do the job, but doesn't endanger somebody. And we've had the temperature checks. We've had, the GSA is coming in and doing regular cleanings rather aggressively. It's a tough situation, and she's handled it well. But overall, how do you do that job? How do you do those three jobs? By the way, the other thing is there's always tension, as you know, between the East and West Wing, between the First Lady's office and the president's political team.
Tell me about it.
Especially maybe on occasion in the Clinton White House. Even just doing those two jobs, it's hard to imagine. And then you throw in the communication. It's and then not being able to really speak publicly. So, but Sean, the thing is, after that first performance. He came back on the Monday and held a press conference. And this time, first of all, he had a suit that fit a little better. We know the president didn't like the suit he was wearing when he came on Saturday. The podium, they had realized they could lower the podium a little bit, which made him look a little bit taller. A few things. And he came out, and when he called on me, I asked him a question, which, by the way, I'd asked Josh Earnest almost exactly the same question when he became press secretary. But with Sean, there was a real need to ask the question. Basically, in light of what happened on Saturday, can you just, clarify the nature of your job? Is it your intention to always tell the truth from that podium, or to the truth as far as you know it? And he gave me a good answer. He said, yes, it's a serious job, et cetera, et cetera. But for some reason, he took offense to that. He thought that I was questioning his integrity. How dare I ask him if he would tell the truth?
Right. You write about that in the book too. That encounter.
And it set off a whole series of events. And there's a whole series of things about Sean. It was really quite a time. And I still had to obviously regularly deal with him because he was the press secretary. But the interactions were often hostile, and he was always had his back up, and there are some pretty dramatic scenes described in the book about that relationship.
I had the same. I'll tell you a little story. I had the same encounter once with Helen Thomas, who was the venerable UPI White House correspondent there for years and years, and she once asked me, "Is it ever appropriate for the press secretary to lie? Or do you always have to tell the truth?" And I said, yes, you always have to tell the truth, but sometimes you have to tell the truth slowly.
That's excellent.
And I got in huge trouble for saying that. But, I was thinking all right, if you know that there's going to be an attack, in fact, it was literally, that was the question. We were going to have an attack on Osama bin Laden, and you knew that was going to happen, and you couldn't tell the press, oh, yeah, by the way, you all need to kind of hang around here today because we're going to go to war later today. But you couldn't say that, but you had to kind of figure out ways in which you could sort of stumble around and keep people aimed at the truth, even if you were not going to be able to kind of be completely forthcoming with what you actually knew. It's a real challenge sometimes to be in that position of knowing things that you can't really say, but on the other hand, you can't lie.
Yep.
And so it is very, very difficult. Jonathan, I want to get back to the book. Walk us through the book a little bit. You have some fascinating chapters. You talk about some of the things that you were able to cover and that you were a part of at the White House. But I want to give you a chance to kind of unpack a little bit of what's in this great book.
Well, the first thing is what I try. My goal in writing this book, more than anything, obviously you want to have reporting that nobody else has had. You want to provide more insights into the inner workings of the administration. you want to capture some of that drama. But more than anything, more than any of that, more than the scoops, more than any of it, what I wanted to do is I wanted to convey a sense of what it has been like to be part of this, to be a reporter during this extraordinary time, to be covering Donald Trump, to be on, starting with the wave of the campaign and all that encompassed, and into this White House, what it is, because the experience has been, I think that I'll be sitting around telling these stories, hopefully if I live that long, deep into my 80s, we'll be on some beach somewhere, and oh my God, you're not going to believe, what happened here. This has been an incredible experience. It has been exhausting. It has been at times exhilarating because the public interest in all things related to this White House has been higher than just about anything else I have covered. And that includes people that despise the president as well as people who love the president. People are fascinated by what has happened. They're interested. They're paying attention. Some may be getting a little exhausted by now, but during the arc of this story, it has been, the spotlight has been incredibly bright on that White House. So I wanted to kind of portray a little bit of what that is like day to day, and the chaos, and the to be covering a president, trying to cover him fairly and objectively, even as he is personally insulting you and your profession. How do you do that? How does that all play out? So as I wrote the book, I thought it was going to be, when I started, mostly kind of like I would start with day one in the White House. And what I realized is there was so much that you needed to understand about Trump before January 20th, 2017. So a third of the book is actually before the inauguration.
Right.
And some of the stuff I loved about writing it was diving back into that period of time. So, for instance, I happened to be in the Oval Office the 2 days after the election in 2016, when Donald Trump, for the very first time, met personally Barack Obama. They had this drama that had played out, since for the previous 5 or 6 years, all the whole birther stuff and all of that. They had been the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2011 when the President Obama taunted him, all of that, but they had never actually met. So I, how it works, and I explain in the book. I try to give people a sense of how it works inside the White House. The stuff you and I take for granted, but most people don't. They're not inside. How does it work? Where do the reporters go? Who is where? How do you get to where you're going to be? How do you cover this? But as you know, in the Oval Office, it's always a pool of reporters, and news organizations take turns. It's a very small group of reporters because it's a small space. And it happened to be my turn to be in the Oval Office for that historic moment. And there's a photograph that I actually took a lot of photos of that moment on my phone.
By the way, the photos in the book, and you credit Doug Mills among others who they are fabulous. That is like one of the great parts of the book.
That was really fun, putting together the photo section and writing the captions. It's almost like a separate book. Is that photo insert? But I had my phone, and you know how it works when there's we call it a pool spray, when the press is brought into the Oval Office to take pictures, to hear the statements, the public statements of whoever the president is meeting with, and then to be ushered out while we ask questions on the way out. You know how that works. But before going into the Oval Office, the press pool assembles by the Rose Garden in the Colonnade, right outside the door to the Oval Office. To go in, we're usually brought in about a minute or two before the door opens, and we quickly go in and then we quickly leave. Well, I went out with the press pool on this day, 2 days after the election in 2016, in the Obama White House, and we waited to go in, and we were out there for, about an hour waiting to go in to see the president and the president-elect, which never happens. But it was just the two of them in that Oval Office. And by the way, someday there will be like a great play that is written about that period of time.
About
meeting.
that moment. I mean,
Yeah, those two men alone in the Oval Office after the election that shocked the nation, shocked the world. And we are outside because nobody expected, it was supposed to be a quick meeting, like about 20 minutes. So we go out, in minute 19, and then the thing is still going on. And on and on and on, and we're waiting. And at one point I look out and I see Jared Kushner and Dennis McDonough, the chief of staff, and the incoming son-in-law and staff, and they're outside and they come to look in. They see the meeting still going on and they take a walk around that track that's in the White House South Lawn, and they come back again after it takes a while. What's that? Is that how long? How is that a quarter? How long is that track?
About a quarter of a mile.
About a quarter of a mile.
Right.
Yeah. So after that they come still going on, and they take another loop, and then I look over across the Rose Garden and I see the people that I had met and I described. And I love going back and seeing this. The very early days of that campaign, when there was really nobody working for the Trump campaign, it was just a handful of people, including his former caddy. Former Ralph Lauren model and spokesperson for Ivanka's product line. Just a very small group of people, a former intern or junior person at Fox News who came in. And I look over and I see Dan Scavino, who is the former caddy who became the manager of his Twitter and Instagram accounts. Hope Hicks, the spokesperson, original spokesperson.
Now back in live action.
Yes, and a couple of the others originals, and they're all and they're across the Rose Garden, and then they're walking up the colonnade, and they pause and they take selfies, like almost like a tourist would, because I don't think any of them had ever stepped foot in the White House before, in any capacity. So here they are, coming in. Basically, they're about to take the place over, and they're kind of like, everybody's in awe. Nobody can really believe what happened, including the president-elect, Donald Trump. So what I did is I went back and I described that scene. And by the way, so I was talking about my phone, so I actually shot a video, which I couldn't put a video in the book, but maybe we'll find a way to put that out. But I shot a video of that once we were finally called into the Oval Office, walking in, and it's really just wild to see. And I end up sitting right up against the couch, about 1.5 feet from President Obama, about 5 feet from Donald Trump, for this moment. And then I took a few still pictures, and I saw a side of Trump that I had never ever seen before, and I never saw since. First of all, it was the first time he had ever been into a room where Donald Trump wasn't the one calling all the shots. Okay, come in, and we're going to do this. Because this was Obama's meeting. Obama's the president.
Right.
So Obama's calling us in. Obama's doing the first remarks. Obama is, handing it off to Trump to speak. Obama's the one. And Trump seems, to me, at that moment, humbled by the moment. Maybe even a little freaked out by the moment. He had just spent, an hour or so with the President of the United States, describing some of the real challenges he was going to be facing. He's sitting in the Oval Office, and I think it is dawning on him. Yes, he won the election. It was great. He loved the campaign, but now this is going to be his.
Well,
he has the responsibility.
We will someday learn exactly the contents of that. There's been some description of that, among other things. Obama apparently said that North Korea is the thing that you're going to have to pay the most attention to.
And Mike, by the way, I went back and talked to everybody that was there that day. I mean, I went back to talk to the senior people who on the Obama team, to those who traveled with Trump, and I tried to reconstruct to the best extent possible, to the greatest extent possible, what happened both in that meeting and also, around the White House on that day, because it really is a singular day in American history. So that kind of stuff, that's the first part of the book. The early days in the Trump campaign, some of the stuff back in my New York Post days, some of the key moments. I don't try to be comprehensive. you can't cover everything, but I try to cover the moments that I have something unique to say, where I, either through reporting that I have uncovered that hasn't been out there before, or something I personally experienced, where I have a unique perspective on moments that maybe you all saw play out. Everybody saw that moment play out, but I try to bring something that is a perspective that for the most part, nobody else could have.
You know, we're almost at the end of the conversation here, and it is a great read. You've really captured so much after this. But as we kind of wrap up here, you know, what was the most surprising thing that you kind of thought about or wrote about as you did the book? I mean, what was the one thing that, you know, sort of said, I'm really surprised I'm saying this in this book?
Well. One moment is that I write about was when Mick Mulvaney was made acting chief of staff. He called the senior West Wing staff out to Camp David to have basically a group meeting over the weekend to kind of talk about how they would approach things. And Mulvaney was in many ways very, very thoughtful about this. He reached out to other former chiefs of staff. He had read a book about the job of chief of staff, and he had kind of learned some lessons from that. But what I found interesting, I found out that he actually had recommended a book called A First Rate Madness, a book that makes the case that some of the greatest leaders in history have been mentally ill, and that some of the worst leaders in times of crisis have been people that were eminently sane. So I thought this was really an unusual. I mean, we could ask why he would recommend such a book. But I actually reached out to the author of the book. The book was written in 2011, so it was before, or 2012, somewhere in there. So it was before, Trump came on the scene. So he's obviously not part of it. But it, makes the case that, Neville Chamberlain was a perfectly sane and stable guy and completely unable to deal with the insanity of the rise of Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill came in, who in this author believes had a mild mental illness, and he was Winston Churchill. McClellan, General McClellan, was a upstanding, great, Army officer, perfectly sane, and completely unable to deal.
And U.S. Grant was an alcoholic.
And Sherman was out of his mind, and So anyway, so that was an interesting little.
On that very cheerful note, we end our book chat. But it is a great book, and you provided so many good personal insights. But I hope you get a lot of opportunity to talk about the book and share some of your experiences and talk about some of the things that you've seen in the book. It really is terrific.
Thank you, Mike. And I just want to say just one last thing, which is it's great to have this conversation with you, because the one thing that virtually everybody agrees about when it comes to talking about the job of the White House press secretary is the model for the job, the guy who is the absolute model for how to do it right is Mike McCurry. So thank you.
Thank you for that. My models were Marlin Fitzwater and Jody Powell. So the tradition goes back quite a ways. But thank you for saying that.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards. Please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.